Former ANC National Executive Committee member Trevor Manuel has reportedly criticised political leaders in the country as South Africa battles problems including high crime and worsening power cuts. The Old Mutual chair also accused the ANC of a lack of moral leadership in a recent interview on radio. Let's speak now to Trevor Manuel, who's joining us from Cape Town. A very good evening to you, sir. Grateful for your time. So the comments now about the latest criticism of government leadership or political leadership in the country, I understand, were in remarks you shared in your capacity at Old Mutual with some of the shareholders. For those who've not seen them, please explain what point you were trying to make, especially on that forum.
Thank you very much, Tembakile. Just to be truthful, I'm not in Cape Town, I'm in Johannesburg.
Apologies.
It's traditional for the chairperson of a company to have comments in an annual report or in integrated report. So these are the remarks in the integrated report. They are in the context of the company. And so, it's quite important that I make the point that it's a conversation we must have with shareholders because it impacts on our performance. The general performance of the company was very strong last year, and this performance was achieved notwithstanding particular difficulties. And the first of those difficulties that we draw attention to is the impact of load shedding. We're in a privileged position that we have two large offices, one in Johannesburg, one in Cape Town, where we've got generators and a big solar farm in Pinelands in Cape Town. It doesn't affect people who work in the office, but the bulk of Old Mutual's activities are actually in offices in towns and townships that are impacted upon, where the situation is pretty much akin to small business. So power outages, the absence of water, safety and security, all of those issues matter a heck of a lot to the way in which business is conducted in communities. And so these are the matters we've called out. And the sterling performance has happened notwithstanding the power outage. But that's not the only issue. We've also called attention to the epidemic of crime and corruption, which it doesn't appear that we're about to turn the corner on this. If you look at some of the crimes, there are about 16,000 kidnappings a year in South Africa, according to available statistics, and about 30,000 murders a year in South Africa. Now, 30,000 murders a year, 82 per day, is a large number. But if you compare it to the fact that 8,006 people were killed in the war in Ukraine in 12 months, February to February, and you look at the 30,000 in South Africa, we have to sit up and take notice about this. But then we must also, Tembakile, look at the failings of the police to actually arrest, prosecute, and deal with issues. I mean, with a degree of fanfare, some people were arrested for the assassination of AKA and Tebs in Durban recently. Big story, they were arrested in Cape Town, 1,600 kilometers away, returned to Durban and then released. There have been no other arrests. We also know that, Bafana, national captain and goalkeeper, is murdered, and it's been a comedy of errors. You look at the trial, it's impossible to pin the murder on anybody, and it's so many years later. Or you can look at the street in Philippi this morning where Louisa Nkohla was just gunned down. It's a time of the assassin, and I think we must be exceedingly concerned about this. It's not possible to have normal life in an environment where crime happens at this rate, and then we must deal with the levels of corruption and the fact that there appears to be too little consequence as well. And then we must also look at the quality of public services available to people.
And would you agree, sir, that the lawlessness at community level is a reflection of the lawlessness right at the top when you look at the people in charge of the country? Because if there isn't a sense that people are obeying or playing by the rules there, why would someone in a suburb, in a township, behave any differently within their context?
Oh, of course, Timbukile, you are perfectly correct about that. I've actually looked at the kidnapping stats, and the bulk of them happen in townships where poor people live. So it's not in the rich suburbs. The bulk of the kidnappings happen to poor people by poor people, and it's a deep, deep tragedy. And unless we can have a different conversation about this, I can't actually see the end in sight, because these crimes are being perpetrated by people who live in the communities as well. And so we need a different conversation about this, and we need adequate policing.
Let me ask you then about...
How many stories are there of police who don't actually respond when crimes are reported?
I want to go back to another issue that you raised, which affects you directly as someone who works with Old Mutual, right? It's one of the businesses which have seen the impact of the rolling power cuts, which have intensified, especially in the last, 6 to 12 months. We're now dealing with stage 6 even this week. And when you go back and trace the history of these blackouts, and when the first warnings were sounded basically about the fact that we would reach a point in this country when the infrastructure would be old and demand would outstrip supply, you were among the people already in government, already in cabinet. Why was there such a missed opportunity in preparing as far back as the late 90s for a moment such as this? Because I think a few weeks ago, last month, in fact, I had a conversation here on the show with Minister Kumbutsa Ntshavheni, who was saying, they're a new cabinet and should not be held responsible for the mistakes or failures of previous cabinets.
Let me make 2 points. The first point is that the rules were, we're going to talk about Old Mutual, and you're stepping outside of those rules. You know that, and I know that. And your viewers know that. The second issue is that I'm afraid Minister Kubai's arguments don't hold, because there's continuity. It's the same party that has been in power since 1994. So don't worry about the individuals, the same party. The policies ought to be consistent, and so that argument doesn't wash. So there were a number of reasons. Sorry?
When did the wagon come off the rails, if you will, as far as governance, right?
Because you want to get into a place that this discussion is not meant to be, Tim. Okay. But I'll allow you to take the wagon there briefly. You see, this has been progressive. The first power cuts in South Africa happened in 2008 and was related exclusively to Koeberg, where there was a problem in one of the reactors. At that time, we had coal-fired power stations generating sufficient energy, but they needed to be planning for the future. But what we're dealing with now, and you should listen to the Minister for Electricity on this, if there were adequate repairs and maintenance of all of the power stations, all of the generators in each of the power stations, ensure that the turbines are working, ensure that the boilers are in tip-top condition, ensure that the mills are bringing powdered coal into the power stations, there is the ability to extend the life of them. But to deal with a just transition, it's also important to bring into play a lot more renewable energy. These things need to happen together. There was never a call that we will shut down coal-fired power stations. If we can have less effluent producing power stations, such as the transition at Tutuka to gas, of course it'll work in the medium term. But these are complex technical issues, but they must also be accompanied with a determined effort to root out the corruption in Eskom. And there's sufficient evidence for us to be deeply concerned about the levels of entrenched corruption in Eskom.
And I wonder if then... you see a role...
And suppliers such as coal suppliers,
right.
for instance.
Just on that, because I think we've got about 2 minutes left, sir. I wonder if you see a role, as someone who's now in the corporate space, for business to play in terms of moving South Africa forward on a positive trajectory, because the problems affect not just the corporate sector, but also society at large. And it's at a point where it feels as though with each month, each day where people don't have power, people don't have work, there's rising crime, as you were saying, people feel increasingly hopeless, or a sense that something's got to give?
Look, as it happens, Tembekile, Old Mutual is actually the largest contributor to renewable energy, given the extent of investment in solar and wind across the length and breadth of South Africa. Those numbers speak for themselves. It's a progressive issue, and we must address it. I think the other issue that we need to be mindful of in South Africa is that businesses have stepped up to the plate, like business did in 2020 during COVID, when it formed the Solidarity Fund, managed the fund, ensured that there was PPE and other necessary equipment available, but also ensured that the first vaccines were available, funded by business. And I think that just last week, a delegation of business met with the President and a delegation of Cabinet to reinforce the commitment of business to want to drive change. But it can't be business, because the primary purpose of having government is to deliver a whole range of services. And we must call that out as well. And if there's inactivity and lethargy on the part of government, we won't be able to provide for the people of South Africa the quality of life that I think we all deserve.
And just on that, right, a clear distinction on who has which responsibility to society. The relationship between government and business has often been scrutinized, some wary of too much of a close association, but also a great deal of criticism when corporates are critical of government. How should that line be walked on either side to make sure that ultimately everyone is able to speak freely without bullying or interference from either side of the aisle?
Well, I think it's like any relationship. It needs to be worked at considerably. But I think within the context of that relationship, Tembekile, we need to see that both government and business are bringing their part. There are some aspects of what I've raised where business has very little place, such as providing safety and security to the people of this country. That is narrowly a state responsibility. In the main, providing education for our children is primarily a state responsibility. Ensuring that our infrastructure operates, especially from the state-owned corporations, is a state responsibility. All of those things must be delivered on. And then, in addition to that, I think the private sector can come in. But we must avoid a situation where government doesn't deliver, for instance, crime prevention, and then says, well, it's the private sector's fault. It's not going to work on that basis. We've got to call out the issues for what they are, and what the chairman's address in the integrated report of Old Mutual does is to call out the lack of decisive leadership on a whole range of issues.
Old Mutual Chair Trevor Manuel, good to speak to you, sir. Thank you for your time.